key. Dr. Mitchell Chang, professor of higher education and organizational change at UCLA, found reasons why the students in our lives should value the experiences they bring to college classrooms. By sampling viewpoints of students as articulated in those college classrooms, Dr. Chang found those viewpoints to reflect racial and ethnic diversity. Further, he found those viewpoints to have been shaped in part by the segregation that many students experienced prior to college. In our conversation, we talk about his research, links between diversity and achievement, and roles that parents can play helping students navigate difference. There were a few technical challenges this time around as I tried to tape this interview outside of my studio, but I hope you will join us. All right, so I'm actually recording this podcast or this session from my day job. So I'm in a focus room, and fortunately, I was able to put the background in that I usually put in, but it's a little darker here because I don't have the lighting that I usually use. But anyway, but that doesn't hinder us from having a great conversation. So today I've got a colleague of mine. We have been working together on a project from a long time ago, Dr. Mitchell Chang. He's at UCLA, but I'll let him give a full introduction of himself.
Arnold, thank you for reconnecting. It's great to see you again, and it's been a long time.
Yeah.
But you know, not too much has changed for me. I'm still at UCLA. I'm a professor of education in the School of Education and Information Studies, and now it's been almost 3 decades over there. I will share with you that in July I'm moving into some administrative work half-time as Associate Vice Chancellor of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCLA. So I'll be doing that. I promise to stick around for 3 years of that. So we'll see.
Right.
We'll see. So as I said, not much has changed. I'm still doing what we were doing 20 plus years ago, and doing it in a different capacity.
That's awesome. Yeah, when we first started working together, it was at the time of the two University of Michigan cases. There was the undergrad and there was the law school case. And what we were trying to do as a group of researchers, policy advocates, was to assemble the kind of research that would provide a good background for the factual components of those cases. And so one of the things that I was really interested in being able to do is through a journal that I was editing at the American Association of Community Colleges, was to share with them research that you had done that pointed out the truth of the perspectives that a diverse student body can bring to a college campus. So I wanted to start off talking a bit about that research, if you wouldn't mind sharing it.
Yes, and thanks for doing that. It's funny because some of those publications that were not your traditional peer review research journal still today get tons of citations.
Really?
Yeah, tons of interest. I know one of our colleagues, Jeff Milam, another one, Anthony Antonio, helped work on some of those as well. And we're so proud of them because we were able to compile the empirical research and empirical evidence and put it out there in a way that was very accessible to a wider audience, which isn't always the case with journal articles. But yes, that research set the foundation for the next 20 years. And that's another thing that it did, which I've come to appreciate, is that it guided the research for the next generation. So since that work was published, I've had, I would say at least a dozen doctoral students that I've advised who have since become the leading researchers now around issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And even I've been involved with the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill case as an expert witness, and noticed that the plaintiff for that case, the SFFA, which stands for Students for Fair Admissions, which is,
Right.
kind of misnomer in my
Right.
judgment, but in any case, that research body of research now is so strong and so compelling that they don't challenge it. They don't even challenge it. So the idea that racial diversity adds value to a learning environment is, I think, so compelling, not only for higher education, but now there's work in the K-12 sector showing that there are these benefits for those students who attend more racially diverse schools or institutions. So yes, the research is not only stronger, but I think we're understanding what it takes now to understanding better what it takes to realize those benefits. Yeah, well, in the case regarding race conscious admissions in higher education, educational benefits means, if a student enrolls in a college that has a student population, in this case, let's say undergraduate student, that's racially diverse, they're more likely to come in contact with other peers and students who don't always share their viewpoints, don't have the same experiences that they do, maybe have practiced different cultures, have different native languages, whatever it happens to be. Bottom line is they're different. And the idea is that race very much shapes the experiences that we have, and in so many different ways, largely because of the long history of racism in our country, and we're still living the vestiges of those kind of problem policies and state-sponsored racism. So segregation, racial segregation being one of those. So those different experiences shape those students, and when they enter college, and now they're in a setting that's different from where they grew up, different from the kinds of schools that they were at, and they're meeting people who are very different from them. And this kind of different when they engage with each other, both in the classroom and socially. We've been able to document the educational effects of such engagement or interaction across difference. And it has consistently shows that when students take advantage of such an environment, either through taking courses or socializing with, or just engaging through different workshops around topics of difference, and basically the idea, I think that central idea is this willingness to travel across difference, and it's so very, very important. And having an educational setting that supports one's travel across difference, or people used to refer to as engagement
Okay.
in diversity, but now I
Right.
like to think of it as traveling
Okay.
and the willingness to do it. And you almost have like this passport, when you start a college and you want to make sure that you get as many stamps as you can. I remember in college when I got my passport, looked at it, it was kind of empty. I'm like, oh, I want to get as many stamps. Well, you have to be willing to do that. And when you're willing to do that, it's been well documented in the research literature that students end up benefiting a great deal, not only being more satisfied with college because they're getting the experience that's very different from what they had before they entered college, but also that they have their cognitive benefits, and the other set of and a sense that they understand the world better, right? That they are better prepared, that they're stronger intellectually, but they're also what we call democratic benefits, and these benefits have to do with willingness to engage in the democratic process. What do we mean by that? Well, it turns out that students who engage more with diverse opportunities are also more willing to vote
Okay. See?
in elections, more willing to be engaged in communities, more willing to volunteer. I mean, it's those kinds of things that we hope when students graduate that they will do to help strengthen the democracy of our nation. So there are these there's a wide range of benefits, and that has to do with entering a setting that has this kind of racial diversity.
Right. What's interesting when I think about that is the conundrum that's presented, because students like myself, and you perhaps experience the same thing, when you're one of, the only one, you're put in this position of feeling that you have to explain, the broad breadth of African-American perspective in a white context, for example. And for some people, they may be up to the challenge, but I don't necessarily expect that of everyone. So for me, because I've studied African-American history and culture in many different forms, I'm in touch with a lot of that, so that I have a range of views that I can offer, when the time or when the context requests it. But not everybody has, that luxury or has had that kind of exposure. And so for people who are still trying to figure things out for themselves, and like who they are, and who they are in those different contexts, I can imagine it being that much more challenging, in addition to just being put on the spot, right? So it's a conundrum for me, because in some ways we're asking students of color to bring that, right? We're saying that the Supreme Court has said that there is a value in the perspectives that emerge from your experience. Thus, bring that so we can justify the Supreme Court opinion that we've issued, and thus to continue to justify affirmative action when it comes to higher education. But what is your take on that, like that conundrum of not wanting to put that burden, but by the same token, know that it's requested in order to validate the
Absolutely. Absolutely. And 20 years ago, that was more often the case, because the diversity across institutions was pretty small. I mean, I remember when I did my study in 1996, what I consider a diverse institution was an institution with 10% students of color.
Right.
Now we're seeing in a span of 20 years. I mean, this, and we knew this was going to happen, that we were talking about the demographic changes.
Yeah.
Now we don't consider 10% to be diverse. I mean,
Right.
we're now looking at institutions that are 55%, if
Mhm.
not more. We got Hispanic serving institutions, Asian Pacific Islander serving institutions, and so forth. And so just compositionally it's changed, which is to say that in the early days, the burden on students of color was a lot higher. You know, there was much more of a burden because the numbers were so small. So this is why numbers are so important. And this is, and because it places less burden on students to represent certain voices
Yeah.
that are absent.
Right.
And when you only have a few,
Right.
they feel compelled to have to represent, you know, those voices. But when you have more,
Right.
you know, you share that across the board for different students. And
Yeah, but just the idea that if you speak from your experience, that you are providing a service to the institutions that you attend in a way that honors the decision that was made, that would, you know, like, again, I don't know if anyone ever says that to students, but it does help to provide the case for it, you know, if someone does that. The other thing I wanted to speak to is that, you know, as we're talking about the diversity of viewpoint, that it could be in topics where race and ethnicity are nowhere near like the you know, the forefront, but let's say criminal justice, for example, or you know, views on the roles of the founders of the country, or you know, just views on history in general, right? And we're seeing that coming up, you know, flare up in different states. But the perspectives that people have on these matters, again, may not just be about race relations per se, but a person's experience can influence how they think about a range of topics. And so that's something else that I don't know that people spend enough time thinking about. But that's definitely something that was covered in the research that you did.
Absolutely. And yeah, they're not always, you know, race-based, but there are, you know, many topics that
Mhm.
once race shapes your
Right.
thinking about it and
Mhm.
experience with it.
Right.
Criminal justice system, a good example of that, and that comes up in a lot of you know, courses that students take.
Mhm.
But the bottom line is just being in an educational setting where people come to understand that their own experience doesn't define the
Mhm.
world.
Mhm.
And this is something, you know, adolescents, my kids for sure, have to outgrow. That as teenagers, they think the world revolves around them,
Right.
and that everyone else, certainly in their little peer groups, that they're so, you know, dependent on and tied, linked to,
Mm.
all share their values and worldviews and viewpoints, and then suddenly being in an environment where other, you know, you're meeting people that don't share that, and doing the hard intellectual work to understand why.
Right.
Why is it that someone sees the world so differently from
Mhm.
you? And in the case of race, why might race um, be a factor in shaping people's experience? And then and where they're, when folks are sincere about, you know, examining this, and let's say Asian student who grew up in, San Gabriel Valley in Southern California, which is, a predominantly Asian community,
Okay.
comes to UCLA and meets a white student who, grew up in, the west side of LA, which is more affluent, and learning that, well, we're living basically the same region of the world, but the state in this case, but yet our experiences are so different, and we come to understand important issues quite differently.
Right.
Now, I don't have to agree with you.
Right.
That's not what diversity is about.
Right.
We don't have to agree with each other, but we need to start to see and appreciate why we have a different, opinions about this.
Right. Right.
And being able to do that in a setting, educational setting, is very, very powerful. Very, very powerful.
Yeah, it's funny because the more that I think about this, the more I'm realizing how the ways that we show up, particularly as students of color, to predominantly white settings, that in some ways we are the force of assimilation, or the threat of rejection, would cause us to want to potentially suppress those kinds of thoughts, right? I've been thinking about this a lot, this idea of us hiding ourselves intellectually, or hiding those things about us that make us who we are culturally, again, in order to fit in. And in the case of African Americans who are very fair skinned, sort of hiding their genealogical truths of their backgrounds so that they can pass. So there's a lot of this suppression that takes place. But what we're talking about right now is the value of claiming that, and bringing that and articulating a voice through that, into the spaces where we're together to help others understand more perspectives, or to reconcile with more perspectives, viewing the same set of circumstances, the same historical, facts, or the same realities, from a policy perspective. So this is.
You're touching on something that's so important, Arnold, and again, this is part of the evolution of diversity, to not stand out, to buy in
Right.
to a system, so that they can improve their lot in life. That totally makes sense, right? Why people would do that. The damage done, the psychological damage of, as you put it, suppressing your so-called true self, to feeling less than, because you don't have that preparation to travel in certain spaces that you want to get a pass to travel in.
Right.
So there's those negative sides. But here's the thing about diversity, and this is why, again, the numbers are so important, and why the numbers have a profound effect. When you increase the numbers, they do have a profound effect on what happens in the environment, and which eventually begins to have an effect on reshaping the culture of those institutions. For example, if you, as the numbers of African American students increase, we also know very well that this population is diverse, diverse in so many ways, and it's also very rich for students of that particular race to see the diversity within their own group,
Yes.
and engage with each other in these ways, and to understand, you know, the benefits or shortcomings of the strategies that they're taking to improve themselves and their opportunities in life, and for other people to see that as well. There's no one approach, there's no one thinking. You know, these populations are diverse, but there's certain patterns and tendencies, right? You're going to get, you know, 80% that's going to vote this way and 20% that aren't, you know, but you still have that 20% that within that population that see it differently. So you want to have that richness as well, and that's really important, and to understand, and for those students who view themselves in certain ways, and this is why this age group is so important to have that exposure, because they're still trying to figure things out. They're trying to figure themselves out, and when they have other peers that they can walk with to who are also trying to figure themselves out and engage with, I mean, it regardless of where they end up, it's so much healthier, right? For them in terms of developing identity, and we know that, you know, identities are complicated. so you know, there are so many things going on, but here's the other thing about environment. So when you have that kind of environment where the numbers are higher, you do move away from an environment that's pressuring the underrepresented to conform and assimilate, because that's the early version of the diversity project and the early version of inclusion. Yes, we're going to include you, but here's the here's the deal. You have to assimilate into what we call the norm. Right. You have to speak a certain way. You have to dress a certain way. You have to appreciate the same, you know, interests, music, food, that the dominant group or those who are in charge, a privileged group, appreciate. So that early inclusion is one of assimilation. But now that when the numbers are up, you know, you still have folks who feel that that's the best path to take, but you have many others who say, nah, you know what, I want you to you know, come into my space, rather than me always having to be the one to go into your space. And so we're seeing a renegotiation of space. And I think it's a renegotiation of power as well. So, but you can't renegotiate power without numbers. We know that. And this is why alliances across race is so important. And we know that they're fragile, but they're important because, you know, the numbers aren't there. When you have Black and brown students all, you know, creating allyship with their white counterparts as well, to renegotiate power and to re-understand and reshape what the norms, right? And to relieve people of the burden of feeling like they don't belong, that like their background is inferior, that they have to, you know, adjust themselves in a way that conforms to a certain privileged culture. You know, that's starting to wash away a bit on campuses that are, you know, more diverse, and that come to understand that, you know, the privileging of certain ways of being in
Right.
this world may have certain oppressive kind of parts to it, right?
Right.
So that's the other thing that we're seeing with this evolution of diversity, is that these institutions, the culture within the institution is changing in a way that there's less pressure for students to have to assimilate to what was once very much, white privileging of whiteness, right?
Mhm.
And having to feel like they're always trying to catch up
Right. Right.
because they were born with those privileges
Mhm.
to begin with, so they're catching up. And once they catch up, guess what? They change the rules. That's what a lot of Asian Americans are finding out. And that's part of the issues that Asian Americans have with the glass ceiling or the bamboo ceiling, is that, folks are saying, hey, look, we played by the rules. We assimilated. We adopted a foreign, culture and norms, and then and now we expect we would expect to see the same returns that whites get,
Mhm.
and they're not seeing that.
Mm, mm, mm. So how how would you articulate this challenge? Or I'm saying challenge because I'm thinking about what we were discussing earlier about students to be able to take on the challenge of helping to diversify. Now in some ways, when you were talking about traveling across cultures, I think you meant all cultures traveling across to another culture, and not necessarily students of color. But
Absolutely,
right,
absolutely. Thanks for that clarification.
yes,
That's right. It's not one way.
right,
It's multi-directional,
right,
not just bi-directional. It's in a diverse campus. It's multi-directional.
yes. But what I'm thinking about also is what those of us who know better, what we could be saying to parents to help them prepare their children better, uh, or to equip them for that challenge, for the challenge of stepping into that space, knowing that their experience might be called upon in order to help broaden perspective,
That's right.
in a higher education setting.
That's Arnold. I mean, you're asking great questions that I think really helps us reveal what we've learned over the last 10, 20 years since you and I engage in that Michigan case, which, by the way, was the first case where we were able to put together the empirical evidence to defend Justice Powell's claim about educational benefits. Because when he made that claim, it was anecdotal, and
Mm,
he was relying on an amicus brief of elite colleges and universities. But since then, we've been able to show that there are these benefits, and now the evidence is so strong. But we've also been able to show how this kind of experience with diversity has evolved over time. So here's what's important. College for most students is somewhere between 4 to 5 years, right?
mm,
We have to see it as a journey. Not that you're going to benefit the same way you benefited your freshman year as you would your senior year.
mm,
No, it's a journey, and those benefits evolve as the student develops. So the first things first, when a student arrives on campus, they need to find a space where they feel comfortable, where they feel welcome. And
mhm,
this is the importance, and what we've seen as the numbers have grown, is that there have been new spaces created and on campus that weren't there before, that
mhm,
weren't there for African American students, that weren't there for Asian American students or Latinx students, and so forth, LGBTQ students, and so on. These spaces were created in part because of a pushback against assimilation. Now, those who were curious or didn't understand it started to say, well, this is self-segregation, this is balkanization on campus. That's what it looks like to them on the surface, right? No, we're all students. We need to all, you know, we can't segregate ourselves. Well, the deal is certain students who are underrepresented do not feel welcome. And they need to find a space where they feel welcome, because when you travel, you have to travel from a point of strength, right? You can't travel from a point of weakness. It's really hard. When you travel, you're better off, if your journey is long, to have a good backpack. You know, if you're traveling by car, to make sure your car's in darn good shape.
Right.
It may not be the BMW that we had hoped for, you know, early in our lives, but it has to be, you know, it has to be able to take on some good miles. So you have to be prepared, in other words. The preparation for travel is very, very important, because without that preparation, things can go in a negative direction. And we know that too. Diversity doesn't always lead to benefits. There are, you know, when you're not prepared to engage, it can have the opposite effect. It can cause people to become even more isolated, to depart, to disengage. So I would say to parents, the most important thing, you know, next to making sure you're taking care of your academics, is to make sure that you find a space socially where you feel like you belong, you feel welcome, you can start to build on understanding who you are. But along the way, as you're moving through college, you have to be able to also move out of those spaces. You know, you have to use your passport. And you have to go and enter whatever space. You have to engage, take that opportunity to engage with others. You know, and maybe you start in small steps depending on where you are. And then this is the other thing that we know about students. When they come on campus, their you know, their capacity to realize those benefits for themselves relate to diversity are very, very different. Some students, you know, it turns out that they came from a very diverse high school, and the environment, the college is even less diverse than their high school, if you can believe it or not. And then some students are on the other end of the spectrum, where their high school was totally homogeneous, and so forth. So you have students at, you know, it's a different range. So we understand that, and students have to figure out for themselves where they are, find the support that they need to prepare themselves to engage and to make that travel and make that journey across their time when they're in college, and use up that passport.
This is really good. So this phrase that you're using, prepare to engage, is not something that I've really thought about before in this context. So I'm thinking about when my older son was preparing for his junior prom. For his junior prom. And it was the first time I saw him with a tuxedo on. And that was such a touching moment for me. It was like the first time he was sort of being presented to the world as a young man, you know, like, and in that moment, I remember saying, I really need to make sure that when I'm with him in the car, going back and forth to school, that we have the kinds of conversations that will prepare him to engage the world as the young man I just saw in that suit. But what we're talking about now is like a different vector, because we're talking about, you know, again, you know, we're focusing on race. There's all these other issues, but for us right now in this moment, we're talking about race. And people need to be able to engage the world based upon the way the world is seeing them. And if they're seeing them as a young, if they're seeing my son as a young African-American man, he needs to know that and be prepared to engage the world in that way. Now, there's been a lot of talk, there's been talk about the talk, right?
That's
And I'm sure you've heard about this. And
right. Of course.
right, how young African-American men need to be able
That's
to
right.
engage law enforcement if they get pulled over, and that it's better to lose an argument than to not get home, not make it home. So that's one example. But when it comes to the college campus, it makes me wonder whether we've talked about it in that way as well. So another anecdote. So
that's really interesting.
Right. So
yes, I think that's really interesting, and and what you point out is very important. Now that talk, I think, for entering college students, it's different, because as I pointed out earlier, there was a time when those, let's say, African-American students who were most likely to succeed in a predominantly white institution, or at least at the time, almost exclusively white, were those students who were best prepared to enter those settings. Those, as you said, who have made the choice to take a certain pathways that lean into whiteness, because they knew that that's the only way that they can survive and succeed in that system, because that system demands them to lean into whiteness in order to be rewarded, right? So you're just playing that by the rules, and being rewarded are very different. Because I have a colleague who his talk with his kids is, hey, lean into your blackness when you get into college. Lean into your blackness, that wasn't something available to students 20, 30 years ago. But now on most campuses, there is a pocket, on some campuses bigger than others, and space where you can do that. You can lean into your blackness. Likewise with, I see this a lot with my Asian American students, who grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods in the Midwest, and where they were the only Asian Americans, the other one, or one of few, the other ones being their siblings, in a largely white community. They lean into their Asianness when they get into college, and really try to understand what it means to be an Asian American. And so that's the, imagine that now. It's the other talk. This suggests that we've made some progress here, right? We made some progress, because the talk isn't always for everyone. Hey, look, you got to be careful, and we have to do other things to make it easier for the dominant groups to deal with us. Right now, they're saying, hey, look, let's not worry about that. let's show up as ourselves, or not even as ourselves, as people we want to become. So there's a lot more space when it comes to identity. There's a lot more space for that, and I think this is where parents and students need to work together to figure out what the best institution is going to be for their kids, given the preparation that they had, given what they want to become, right? Not only in terms of professional identity, but also in terms of those other identities that they care about. And so, yes, I tell my my sons, hey, choose a campus that will allow you to become the person that you want to be. And are there, they don't they probably want to lean away from Asianness because I emphasize it so much. Right, enough of that. Let me explore other identity. I got that part. I got that part.
That's great. That's great. That's great.
But I want to, so they're ready to travel. Right.
Okay.
I mean, my kids are ready to use their passports, whereas I can see, I've had students that come from the Midwest that didn't have a lot of support to make them appreciate better the unique experiences of being Asian and what that is. Right. And they need to begin their journey by understanding that first. And they need that space to do it before they can travel, across difference.
Right. All right. Well, I have to run. Thank you so much, Mitch. I appreciate all of your time. And
yeah, it's great reconnecting with you, and thanks for the conversation.
Absolutely.
And hopefully next time my internet will be more reliable.
I'm so grateful to Mitch for carving out time from a very busy schedule as a professor, college administrator, and journal editor. Thank you also for sticking it out with me, given the technical challenges this time. To recap some of the highlights, we talked about the benefit that students get from being willing to travel from their own culture into others. But before doing so, Mitch emphasized that parents should equip them to engage the world and to lean into their own experience. We also talked about picking institutions that will help students become the people they envision. Such institutions will also have the places that will strengthen them culturally. This was the kind of discussion that would have me going back to really let what we covered sink in. It definitely felt like a virtual coffee house. Thanks again, and take care.